want to do today is start with the obvious, a story. And as Christy mentioned, I have organized this quarterly storytelling event for the whole community of Richmond and Wayne County, Indiana. And we're just going to jump into this Christmas story, the first story ever told on our stage by a local guy named Dave Jetmore. I want to set the stage for you. It's a bitterly cold day just before Christmas in the late 70s. His family is out shopping. His son comes in with some news.
Children to Christmas shop. It was about a week before Christmas, maybe even closer. And he came into the kitchen and said, "Dad, Billy's dead." Now, Billy was my daughter Annie's goat. This little half-grown goat, and I thought, my God, this can't be. Surely, maybe the goat's just sick. So I put my coat on, Matty put his coat on, we go out to the barn, and sure enough, this goat is literally stone dead. And he must have died that morning because he's frozen solid. And he's frozen in a standing position. I mean, his little legs are outstretched, his head's up, his eyes are open. He looks like a goat statue. Now, a really good parent, an A-plus parent, would think, what a perfect time to teach a child about death, life, immortality, all those other things that I didn't want to talk about because I'm not an A-plus parent. I'm kind of a B minus sometimes. And I was having a C-plus day. So I said, Maddie, we can't tell Annie about this goat because she'll cry. I mean, she'll be heartbroken. She's just a little 5 or 6-year-old girl. And I said, let's tell her that Billy ran away and he's living with other goats somewhere on this happy goat farm. I know that sounds preposterous, but I only had to sell this to a 6-year-old. So I said, well, we'll get rid of the body. Now, this is not a goldfish that you can flush down the toilet. This is a dead goat.
All right, so I'm gonna leave it there with father needing to dispose of the frozen body of a dead goat. And I start with this story, and I pause the story here for 2 reasons. First, I think it's good storytelling technique. It's the cliffhanger, it's the hook. I promise I'll pay it off and tell you the rest of the story if you stick with me. But I also want to raise the question of what does a storytelling event like this have to do with ministry and have to do with vocation, at least as it pertains to me and some students I get to teach. So I want to first say that story is everywhere. It's one of the things I noticed when teaching story became part of my job. I won't walk through all these, but we talk about narratives all the time. Political narratives, media narratives, narratives that are racist, narratives that are liberatory. And while I kind of tried to find a disciplinary engine for where all this talk of narrative was coming from, it turns out it's a category of analysis that's have interest across disciplines from psychology to social psychology, sociology, critical theory at a range of levels. And blessedly, they all kind of poach on each other, and I do as well. And the claim that I want to distill in all its nuance here that, I don't know, mattered for me is that stories do work. Complicated, I know, but if you teach writing, this is an important thing to notice because often what we teach is craft. We teach how to write a good story. We don't often teach what is the work that story can do in the world? What are the functions that how does story work as a tool? And so that was the premise of a course that I always wanted to teach, and I just tried for the first time. I'll talk about that a little bit. But again, stories do work. And I apologize to those of you who think really hard and in really nuanced ways about narrative, because this is going to be a quick gloss. But stories define who we are as individuals. That's one kind of work. And stories define who we are as collectives. And this is not, as we'll see, an impermeable binary, but these are kind of different levels. let me add a different kind of gloss to this, kind of a different tone to it. Stories are written on us, social stories, and also we write. So this is a nod to sort of the classic agency structure binary, but one that also, I think, leaks a little bit, and we want to exploit those leaks. So on the individual side, you are the story you tell about yourself. This is individual identity. And the claim here from fields like narrative psychology is that identity is narrative. Again, you don't just have a story. In fact, you, as you think of yourself as having an identity, are a life story. The person who's the result of all the things that have sort of culminated in you. But as I tell students, experiences are data, and life comes to us in a big fire hose of unfiltered data, and it doesn't mean anything. We have to have some ways to shape it into meaning. And narrative is one of those ways. We select the bits that we think fit together, give an arc to our story, give it some meaning, and show how it has a certain kind of telos that ends up in us and who we are. So you are identity, but you're not the sole author of your story. Says my connection is unstable. I hope I'm back. But you're not the sole author of your story. Stories also are social, and they bind us. We'll get to for good in a second, but they can bind us for ill. We're born, all of us, into a world that necessarily writes stories on us. And I show this picture here not because I think tattoos are bad, but because I want you to imagine being born into a world in which you get tattoos that you didn't get to choose. They're on your body, they're part of who you are, they're enfleshed in you, and you didn't really choose them. One way to think of this is what sometimes are called scripts, which are accounts of how things naturally, in scare quotes, work, how they should work for different contexts and social locations. Like anytime you hear someone says, that's just how it works in this situation, or for people like that, you're in the midst of a script. We have scripts for how you order at a restaurant, but we also have scripts for what it means to be a man, to be a woman, to be straight, to be gay, to be black, to be white, to be any number of those things. And they can all be problematic in different ways. But at the same time, binding isn't always bad, because stories also bind us for good. And I'm here drawing a lot on the work of the Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann, who talks about story, in his case Torah, but story unifies us via a shared world of values and symbols, oughts and mays, of requirements and permissions. And this is a world that we inhabit that orients us to how we move through it. And it's authoritative, but not authoritarian. I mean, you can talk about, you can tell in Brueggemann's case, the story of the Exodus in different ways with somewhat different nuances about what it means for how people live today, but you can't just change it. You have some freedom to live within it. The story binds you, but not in a narrow way. And importantly, this isn't escapable. Again, stories are written on us. And Brueggemann puts it this way, biblical, he's not talking about the current nation, but biblical Israel knew very well that the alternative to this public experience is not private experience, but rather the alternative public experience of Egypt or Canaan or Babylon. I often gloss Bob Dylan glossing the Bible here and say, Dylan, like, you got to serve somebody. It may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you got to serve somebody. You're going to be written on by something. You're going to be formed by something. It may be consumer capitalism, or maybe Quakerism, or maybe another form of Christianity, but you're going to be written on by something. And tradition is a way to have some say in how you're written on. And I think particularly, I noticed Wes Daniels yesterday talked about apprenticeship to a tradition, carries the sense of binding for good forward. So stories are important to individual identity, and they're also deeply social. What's that have to do with vocation, this idea of writing and being written on? And I borrow this image, the famous image of MC Escher's hands here, to say that this isn't a one-way kind of thing where we're sort of imprinted by social stories that exist in ways that we can't influence. we can act back. There can be kind of an emergent property here. This is a circle, but I don't think it has to be a closed circle. It doesn't have to be a closed system. And I think some of the work of vocation, or for my vocation, are places where you can open that circle and affect that larger writing process. I do want to stop and say how we conceive of vocation differs in sort of different tellings, different books, different approaches. For me, the most influential account of vocation, not really for Quakers, but I read this in a Methodist seminary, is the work of Parker Palmer. Palmer writes in one of his essays, "Discovering vocation does not mean scrambling towards some prize just beyond my reach, but accepting the treasure of true self I already possess." So here, self and vocation are understood via the metaphor of discovery. There's something that's already there. You just need to trust it, to kind of get down to it and let the negative stuff fall away. I very much like Parker Palmer, so I don't want this to be understood as a critique of Palmer, but kind of a different perspective. From the perspective of story, vocation can be understood as co-authoring a life with God. And here you could think of self and vocation as understood via the metaphor of writing, and not writing that's kind of done, but writing that you keep doing. Not discovery, but constant emergence in encounter and dialogue with the divine. I think this it is in some tension with Palmer's really influential account. I don't know that I need to find an absolute tension, because things can always be interpreted towards each other. But I am not actually a theologian, so I'm going to let those of you who are work out the theological anthropology there. But this idea of vocation is something you're constantly discovering in dialogue and encounter, that you're constantly writing, to me can give a kind of openness to it and a kind of ongoing principle of hope. I want to give a few examples of how stories become part of my vocation, and ways I offer story as vocation, an avenue for vocation to students. I want to pause and say that there are sort of pastoral care applications here that deal with individuals. There's a book that I've used called Pastoral Care, Writing the Story of Our Lives by Emory professor Karen Shive, that talks about how you care for individuals by being story companions. My work has been more around ministering to communities via story, and specifically how we can midwife individual stories that aren't always heard or saved or preserved, to make communities sort of more aware of who they are in all their complexity and diversity. And this can take kind of different forms. Model one that is, of many options, but that I'm going to talk about, is what I might call activist oral history. And although, like Studs Terkel is the famous name here, the model I've used has been from an organization called Voice of Witness. Voice of Witness is an imprint of McSweeney's, the organization founded by the writer Dave Eggers, one of my favorites. But what they do is they go to places where justice issues exist, or human rights crises exist, and they talk to people. They talk to people who are living those issues on the ground. They do Q&A interviews with them. They transcribe them, and then they edit out the questions and edit the answers into flowing narratives that are a little bit condensed. They're easier to read. They take strong narrative forms, and they're in forms that can be more easily taught in schools or used in courts. These are used in a variety of ways. But I've used this model in a class that I teach called Writing Mental Illness, where we talk to people who have encountered mental illness from different directions, people who have suffered but are healthy enough to do interviews, but also people who love and for professionally, or because they're friends or family, people with mental illness. And I can talk about some of those stories, but I want to be mindful of the time and just say that some of them have been really powerful, how people have lived what it is to be caught in our mental illness scare quote system. So model one, activist history, voice of witness. Model two, I'm calling community oral history. And the idea here, well, let me tell you a little bit about what this picture is. The picture is of the Riverside Church in New York City. And in the class that I just finished teaching, one of our students has been and continues to be, distance, a member of Riverside. And we basically wound up, my connection is unstable, I hope we basically wound up making her project our project and interviewing elders in the Riverside congregation for their stories of where they came from, how they got to Riverside, and why they stayed as part of their, it's a 90th year anniversary is what we themed it around. Give them a sense of all the individual stories that made up their identity and their tradition, stories that show it kind of a depth and vibrancy and color that, you know, wouldn't otherwise come up. And I think this is a way of deepening tradition, remembering tradition, and moving tradition forward. And I'm going to play an excerpt from one of those, one of the podcasts we did. This is a woman in her 90s named Imogene Stamper being interviewed, and her story narrated by our student Lynette Davis. So take a listen.
I liked the way I was greeted. I liked the way I was treated. And it wasn't as if, because you know what? Making a pet out of him. I wasn't greeted or treated as a pet, because that had happened at some other churches. So I felt comfortable there. And I went for a few years, and then I decided to join the church.
Joining Riverside did not mean Mrs. Stamper found it perfect. Church leaders and Sunday ushers were almost entirely white. The disparity motivated a group of Black Riversiders to organize the Black Christian Caucus. Mrs. Stamper joined them as change was beginning.
One Sunday, one of the Black caucus members put on white gloves and walked down the aisle and became her own usher. We're talking about a woman of color. When she came walking down that aisle, because that had never happened at all. Oh, she had on a red dress and she wore white gloves. And it was something you should have seen. You should have seen that congregation's face. And she became the first female African-American usher. So that was the turning point in the church.
Like, I love that woman's voice. It brings me joy to hear that and to know that I got to play a role in having that recorded. And I should say Riverside, founded with kind of dubious Rockefeller money, but has gone on to become a site of progressive Christianity. Martin Luther King Jr. famously gave his Vietnam sermon at Riverside. And this project helped us preserve memories of different folks in their congregation, which I think adds up to carrying their tradition forward. Okay, let me go back to where we started and pay off the debt that I accrued from my opening. So what I'm calling civic storytelling, I feel part of my vocation is to community and to using story and arts to build even the local community of places like Richmond, Indiana. And part of that vision is summarized in the mission statement of Warp and Woof. Or the definition of Warp and Woof, the essential foundation or base of any structure or organization, from weaving, in which the warp, the threads that run lengthwise, and the woof, the threads that run across, make up the fabric. I admit that I'm kind of proud of that name. I really like that metaphor, because if you think of stories, individual stories as threads, then you think that these stories woven together make up the fabric of this place, of Wayne County. And Warp and Woof seeks to strengthen that fabric by celebrating these individual threads, and to do so in a lively, joyful, and entertaining way. By recruiting storytellers from all walks of life, it aims to introduce people to neighbors as neighbors. In sharing their own stories and listening to those of others, we believe participants in Warp and Woof will build a stronger and more expansive sense of local community. So that's the big hope and the big vision. And I should say that you can do this kind of thing focused on social problems. I feel like our society, and at least this place now, like, we just need to get people who are different in the same room having a good time and telling stories around a theme together. We can clear that lower bar. And I think by and large we have. This is a picture, a collage I made of some of the faces that have been on our stage. We worked really hard to make it diverse in lots of ways, which takes a lot of work. And there have been successes and failures in that, and ongoing challenges, but it's not all a failure either. Some of it's worked. And so I think that doing that helps, again, weave our community together. And so to end, I want to pay off my debt. I want to bring you back to the Christmas goat, Dave Jetmore's story on our stage, the holiday spirit. And let me get you up to speed and say that he has tried to get rid of the goat by burying it, but the ground is too hard. He can't get a shovel in it. He's tried to throw the goat temporarily into a snowbank, and that won't work because the goat is still visible. And so he's in a place of despair. He's driving around trying to figure out what to do in the country with a goat in the back of his pickup. So here we go.
I'm out in the country when I come to this little country church. It's a beautiful little country church surrounded by snow, and there are no houses around, just this church. There's a graveyard behind, and in the front of this church is a nativity scene. And it was beautiful. There was the baby Jesus in the middle, and then there was Mary and Joseph with the baby. And over here were the shepherds who were guarding their flock. They had their sheep. They even had a little burro. And then over here on the right were the three wise men who'd come from afar. And I noticed that the wise men only had 2 camels. And those camels were almost exactly the same size as Billy. So I pulled the truck off the road into the side beside that nativity scene, and 2 of the wise men,
This has literally never done that in any of my practice sessions with this. We'll give him a second.
their hands up. They were holding these little rope halters from their camels. And the one wise man, he just had his hand up. It was empty. So we dusted Billy off, cleaned all the snow off of him, and I crept around there and put him right with that wise man. I think it was Balthazar, the one that came from Egypt with the myrrh. And his outstretched hands perfectly fit that little goat beard. And Maddie and I got back in the truck, and I backed up and I just shone my headlights on it. And Maddie looked up at me and he said, "Dad, that's beautiful." And it was. That goat made that nativity scene. It was crying for a goat. And we were so happy. We were driving down the road, and the last I remember of this story, Maddie looked up at me and he said, "Dad, do they allow goats in heaven?" And I said, "Maddie, if they don't allow goats in heaven, I ain't going." And he said, "I ain't either, Dad." We didn't really realize the theological implications of what we'd said, but it made us feel loyal to Billy. No man or goat left behind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate that. That's a great way to kick us off for our presentations today. I just want to make sure that we have a very brief reminder. As I've said in the emails to all the registrants, we are actually recording this session. And just like yesterday, that we are recording the session, and we are also keeping the chat. And when we get our technological facilities up to snuff, we will figure out how to make this video available to be rewatched at some time in the future. So without any further ado, let's move on to Robin Mohr.
Good morning. I guess it's still morning where we live. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. In March of 2009, I had the opportunity to lead a workshop at the Ben Lomond Quaker Center on primitive Quakerism in a postmodern world with Wes Daniels and Martin Kelly. I think it went pretty well. In fact, I think some of you here today were there. The really hard part was the week after, because I wanted so desperately to do more of that. At the time, I wrote, "I'm wrestling with a nagging feeling that God is calling me to this ministry of hospitality and encouragement, this work of bringing friends together, convening learning communities, facilitating conversations, and supporting friends on their spiritual journeys, which brings me such joy and fulfillment and peace. Aren't I really supposed to be doing this all the time? Am I disobeying God's leading by spending so much of my time earning a secular living? Or is the desire to devote myself to a full-time hireling ministry a distraction or a temptation?" Actually, I think I am given both pieces of work to do. Just as God has called me to be a Quaker and not a Presbyterian, God is showing me what the Quaker path of ministry looks like. I have a competency, as friends have traditionally called it, and I am figuring out how to balance my household chores and family responsibilities, my paid employment, and my religious vocation. Apparently, I am not called to singleness of eye or singleness of purpose. It wouldn't make me happy to be a full-time writer and minister and to watch my children go around with holes in their shoes. It wouldn't make me happy to have $1 million job that required me to work on Sundays or past my children's bedtimes. And it wouldn't make me happy to have a spotless house, but no reason to ever leave it. This vocational dilemma is a major issue for liberal unprogrammed friends. We have a slew of new ministers, many quite young, with a tremendous fire to tend to the ailing religious society of friends. But we don't have a clear view of how to make use of their gifts. If we look around to other religions, we see that they generally send their spiritually gifted young people to seminaries. And we have increasingly encouraged our young people to do that too. But other religions have a more defined career path for seminary-trained ministers, right into paid positions in their church hierarchies, most of which have a broad need for entry-level pastoral staff, along with a few positions in their central offices. Quakers also have those central offices and institutions, but there aren't that many jobs there. What unprogrammed friends don't have, and sorely lack, is a large enough generation above us infant ministers, to quote Samuel Bonus, of men and women who are both living out a deep commitment to local ministry and working in some kind of trade or profession that financially supports their families. The closest examples most of us know of are academics from our grandparents' generation, whose writings have been published and preserved. I think of Douglas Steere or Elton Trueblood or Howard Brinton, for example. There are a few friends who are well known today who are in that same category. There are more who are mostly unknown in wider circles, because while they may be ministering effectively to their local communities, they're not traveling in the ministry or writing for publication much. I can think of several examples in my own meeting, and that's probably why my meeting is thriving today. But there aren't enough of them, God knows why. And at the same time, so many meetings are struggling, and many young people are floundering and not knowing how to proceed. I wonder if, just as 150 years ago, friends hired pastors to care for the influx of newcomers, if today we might be headed toward hiring pastors in order to keep our young people and bring in newcomers. Anyway, this is why I am writing this here today. I want to record publicly that I too am struggling with this issue. I know I am not alone, and I know that this struggle is not because of a mistake or a failure to live out my calling. It is part of the challenge of living as a Quaker in the 21st century. End quote. So as many of you know, in March of 2011, I got the chance to work full-time for an international Quaker institution. For almost 10 years now, I have been paid a living wage to run a small nonprofit organization, facilitate Quaker workshops, and minister to the condition of friends. For those who don't know, my employer is the Friends World Committee for Consultation section of the Americas, which is the association of Quaker yearly meetings across all the branches of Friends, from Alaska to Bolivia. And just to be clear, I'm speaking here today about my own opinions, which may not be the official positions of the Friends World Committee. I am blessed to be able to carry out my calling in my full-time employment, and by the opportunity to use so many of the gifts and experiences that I've accumulated over the years. The job was definitely a dream come true. Even so, I am sometimes still resentful of the blessings in my life because there are still conflicting pressures and limited hours of the day. Even in this pandemic era of working from home, I can't mentally be at home and at work at the same time. As a definition, I think that the work of a Quaker employee is to be a servant, to carry out the will of the meeting or the association of meetings, as the case may be. And I think that the Quaker theology of servant leadership means that success involves the liberation of gifts, my own and others, not the oppression of those gifts. In many ways, Quaker practice is the nurture and the development of the skills of discernment and obedience. And vocational ministry is the active practice of those skills, whether in full-time employment by Quaker institutions or not. I believe that Quaker institutions have, as part of their mandate, formation in the vocation of being the Quakers the world needs. Quaker institutions are tending to the family of friends, or our family is dying. And I don't think that's actually hyperbole. I believe that the conflict, you could call it the dialectic, or perhaps the contradiction, is inherent in a Quaker theology of vocational ministry. As the young folks say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. And in this presentation, I will suggest that there are 3 aspects of Quaker vocational ministry that illustrate this. 3 dyads that may appear to the casual observer as being in conflict, but on closer inspection, from the perspective of a practitioner, they do not have to be contradictory. 1 is the tension between being a prophet and being an administrator. 2 is the perceived conflict between being a minister and a mother. And in this presentation, I'm going to use the term mother, but I'm sure you can understand that I generally mean either parent. And the 3rd is the contest between paid and volunteer ministry. And last, I will speak about the need for role modeling for future generations that will, of course, face these same questions, but need not begin in the same place that my generation did. And in between, I will make good on my promise to Christy to bringing some gratuitous cute kid pictures. So I'm going to share my screen as well at this point. This may be a good moment to remind you that even though I am sharing my screen, you can choose whether to see my face or the group or the slides by changing the settings on your own computer, or to just close your eyes if that's better for you. So I think the conflict is inherent. And there's a initial cute kid picture at the Quaker Center where that workshop was over 10 years ago. So a few years, whoops, wrong place. See, there'll be more cute kids who have given permission to have their images used in this presentation. So a few years ago at the Earlham School of Religion Quaker Leadership Conference, I made an offhand remark that has stuck with me. I said that when Quakers are hiring, we look for prophets, and then we make them administrators. And if you think about it, you may know other examples of that you see in our contemporary environment. Yesterday, Ashley mentioned that sometimes you trade your freedom of expression or your time for the security of a paycheck and health insurance. And I'm here to tell you that every job is like that. The limitations on when you can do it, how to do it, every job, not just Quaker employment. And I think that for me, administrative skills are my tent making exercises or my tent making experience that allows me to do the spiritual ministry that is also inherent in my work. As we spoke about yesterday, I also have a responsibility to the inward teacher and to the community of friends to tell the truth. But it is my experience that being willing to get fired for speaking the truth does not actually result in that, at least not every time. William Barclay, in his study of the Gospel of Luke, said, Jesus promised his disciples three things. You've probably heard this before, that they would be completely fearless, absurdly happy, and in constant trouble. Being a Quaker minister is like that too. All right. Time for another cute kid picture. And this is at Pacific Yearly Meeting. These are my kids and a couple of friends. So it is really important to me that I can be both a mother and a minister, and that Quaker theology and the Quaker embodiment of vocational ministry can encompass both. Oops. There we go. I want to say that I have learned a number of spiritual skills that have been useful in ministry from my parenting journey. Patience, forbearance, forgiveness, self-denial, but particularly early on in my parenting journey, I learned that I would have to do everything in short snatches of time. I slept in short snatches, I ate in short snatches, I talked to people in short snatches, and I prayed in short snatches. I learned a lot about how to begin again and again. One of the apocryphal stories of ministry is the old retiring pastor who said to the young one, "Your only job is to love them." And I think that is also a pretty good job description for mothering. In worship at the end of an international Quaker conference, I looked out on the room and God spoke those words into my life. I try to hold on to that when times are hard, both in the administrivia and when the people I'm working with we'll say they can be difficult at times. But when I hold on to that sense that my only job is to love them, everything else falls into place. There is always going to be a conflict between competing priorities, between my paid work, between rest, between my love work and the housekeeping, homemaking work. I think it's interesting that women have often been asked or told that they can't be a mother and a minister, or a mother and a partner in a law firm, or a mother and the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And so seldom does someone ask how a man can be a good father and a good writer. In a human being, the pursuit of vocation cannot be separated from the rest of life. The ideal of a solitary pursuit is unhealthy for the human condition. Those who are living in enforced celibacy, who cannot feed or clothe themselves, change a diaper, or bathe a dying person, have been deprived of their full humanity. Even a person with a full-time job is not entitled to do only one thing. We live in human community so that no one has to do all the work. An attention to solely intellectual pursuits is not healthy, but neither is solely a caregiving or a trash carrying occupation. That work, those roles are also carried out in late modernity by people who also have responsibilities to their families, their communities, and their spiritual lives. And those who have been celebrated for their sole dedication to one thing have too often been quietly addicted to other self-soothing activities, whether that was alcohol or drugs or other people's wives. What does it even mean full-time? What does that mean for a parent or an artist or a prophet? Cute kid, deep breath. This is Lake Tillicum. One of my children and the son of one of a friend from Northwest yearly meeting, sharing a hat. So I'm going to move on. Oops. Wrong one. All right. So in one of my favorite children's books, Henry and his friend decide to go to Fitchburg to see the country. "I'll walk," said Henry. "It's the fastest way to travel." "I'll work," Henry's friend said, "until I have the money to buy a ticket to ride the train to Fitchburg. We'll see who gets there first." I think that is an illustration of one of the dilemmas of deciding whether work is to be carried out by a paid or a volunteer minister. I often think that my job as an employee of a Quaker institution is that I have been released to do the work that somebody has to do. And in many ways, it's more efficient to do it full-time by competent people over a longer sustained period of time. I think a lot of monthly meetings, particularly in the unprogrammed tradition, would benefit from having religious education and pastoral care organized and at least partially delivered by trained professionals. But a pastor's job, or any minister's job, is also to help people develop their spiritual gifts, not enable them to atrophy. The other aspect of paid employment is the time commitment. And I think in this time of the pandemic, we are learning more about a move that was happening before the pandemic, but I think is going to be accelerated now, that of recovering or defining a post-industrial schedule. I think that pastors often have flexible schedules and office workers often don't. But one thing we have learned from this pandemic is that we don't all have to be in the factory at the same time if we don't actually work in a factory. So this is a first day school lesson, San Francisco monthly meeting, 2006. We're making snickerdoodles. I want to close by thinking about how we model in our own lives this egalitarian model of Quaker ministry, because other friends are watching. In many ways, being a Quaker employee or the employee of a Quaker institution is something like the teachers at my children's cooperative nursery school. The parents were the board of directors who hired the director, who hired the lead teachers. But then those teachers told us what to do, how to teach our children, because they had the training and more experience than any of us parents of preschoolers. And we parents submitted to their authority in that realm, and they submitted to ours in other aspects of running the school. And it was mostly a healthy relationship. I want to mention that you've probably all heard of the imposter syndrome, that sense of being unworthy of the privilege and the responsibility we've been given that afflicts so many of us. In some ways, I see my role as like having been given the keys to the car. I don't own the car, and I can't in isolation decide where the car is going, but I have some latitude and some responsibility to be sure there's gas in the tank and the repairs are done, and to figure out the best route to get there, and then to make moment by moment course corrections using my best judgment and informing the owners and the passengers as needed. In my role, one of my responsibilities is to share what I see and what I know, both from my training and my experience, but also from my opportunities to be with friends in different places. I think a metaphor for this is like the pollinator in an orchard, carrying the life-giving stories from one tree to another. And I have a longer story to tell about that, but I'm going to cut it shorter. The card on the right-hand side of your screen here was a gift to me from a young Bolivian woman at the end of a Quaker conference about 4 years ago. It's important to me. I keep it in my Bible. And it says, "Robin, thanks for your help because your life surprises me." And to me, it is a reminder that just by doing my work, people see it. And for this young woman, it was surprising to see me doing that work. And I wonder how or what new things seemed possible for her because she saw me doing my work, for better or worse. None of us is a single story. And I'm grateful to, I didn't make that up. Quaker theology of vocational ministry has to include that reality. As someone who has spent almost 10 years as a paid employee of a Quaker institution, and 20 years before that as an unpaid minister of the gospel, I can say that there is no one who is undivided in their attention. And in fact, trying to be single-minded often results in other people being denied the opportunities to live into the fullness of their gifts. And that is a sin. Let us walk together in the paradoxes, in the contradictions, and in real life.
Thank you very much for that, Robin, that wonderful presentation. And yes, thank you very much for following my request to have as many cute kid pictures as possible, because why not? I listen to a lot of theology presentations, and they all could be benefited by having more cute kid pictures. I also want to say, if you happen to hear anything in the background coming while I'm talking and when I can't mute, apparently Santa is driving around my neighborhood, and the fire department is helping Santa with his rounds. So I'm going to try my best to not have that interrupt the feed, but I will do my best. Thank you again, Robin. And we next have Kristina, if you would take that away.
Great. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Charisse. Thank you, Carol, for this invitation. I'm really glad to be here, and it's great to see so many familiar faces. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you may be as you are attending this. I am Kristina Keefe-Perry, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to invite us to settle into just a moment, too brief a moment of centering in the divine, and then I'll speak out of that silence. I too am about to share my screen, though I didn't include any cute pictures of my family. I wanted to say that this presentation is, this is not the first time that I've been able to attend the Quaker Theology dialogue group. I have actually been lucky enough to attend in-person sessions at the American Academy of Religion. And as we are discovering in this age of pandemic and shifting to different media of gathering, there are new opportunities that are afforded by our gathering in this way on the screen. And one of those is that this presentation is very much in dialogue with the presentations that happened yesterday. In fact, it is so much so in dialogue that I reorganized it last night and a little bit this morning in conversation with Wes Daniels' paper, which he texted me yesterday evening following a texting conversation that we were having about the similarities of Quaker pastoral theology and a Quaker a theology of vocational ministry. So I'm going to share my screen and hope it works. Nope, that's not what you wanted to see, is it? Do you now see a lot of watercolor? Great. So the original title was Tent Maker and Tailor, Friends as Bivocational Ministers. And that's because I had a scheduled gathering right before this one. I'm part of a fellowship called the Lydia Fellowship. It's a cohort of people who are brought together by the Massachusetts Council of Churches to, and this is quoting their mission statement, to create spaces for pastors to flourish in part-time, provide new models of vibrant ministry for the church. These pastors might identify as part-time or underemployed in their settings and have to take on other work. And I came to this group with a firm belief that in some ways, all Quakers are bivocational ministers, and that the work that I was doing certainly felt like bivocational ministry. And I wanted a community of practice that was broader than my meeting. Why is it called Lydia? Just a little tiny bit about Lydia. Lydia is mentioned both in Acts and in Philippians. She was a successful artisan who dyed purple cloth. She was the first European to be converted to Christianity, and her house was the location for Paul's planting of the church in Philippi. So her hospitality and her work made the space available for this faithful church plant. In fact, she provided a place for Paul and Silas to come and stay after they were released from prison. So This is dedicated to Lydia and Margaret Fell. So what I'm going to try and do is talk a little bit about how, I have to change my view so I don't see all of you, I can see my presentation. Talk about how this is a dialogue with the pastoral theology presentation, and then the way my mind works is we're going to ploddingly kind of go through these terms of what the question, what is a Quaker theology of vocational ministry and how is it enfleshed? Those of us who were lucky enough to be here yesterday heard an engaging and lively discussion of Friends' pastoral theology. Folks may remember Phil Baisley's comment that he hoped he may not be redundant. Taking a cue from him, I ended up revising a lot of my presentation, not in hopes of not being redundant, but of hopes of not being disconnected. So many academic presentations are kind of one-off and papers that could put on the shelf. And I think especially what Wes said about the necessity of apprenticeship needs to be taken up again, and a conversation about that needs to be continued across the divide of Gurneyite, Hicksite, or programmed, unprogrammed friends, however you want to see that. It should be noted that in most of the Christian stream, vocational ministry is equated with pastorate or the priesthood, or if you're a woman, in complementary ministry in religious and family formation. And given that Quakers, in the chaos of England's interregnum, took the Protestant priesthood of all believers a step farther and abolished the laity, it is also Friends who equate vocational ministry as denominational service, even if they don't think of it that way, and even if you're not, like Robin is, clearly serving a denominational body. So I'm gonna, let's try this again. So let's walk ploddingly through some of these terms. Theology. I think I missed something. Quaker. Building off Phil's assertion yesterday that the central component of Quakers is presence in the midst, I wanted to read a quote from Thomas Kelly that was captured in the New England Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice. You can hear pens falling on the floor as I pick up my book. Thomas Kelly says that the blazing discovery which Quakers made long ago is rediscovered again and again by individuals and sometimes by groups. The embers flare up and the light becomes glorious. I just love that description. And yesterday, Wes reminded us that the original Quaker message is a message against the religion of empire. It's a prophetic message and a prophetic practice. We often tell the story of Fox's personal seeking when we talk about the origins of the religious society. I went here and there and saw only professors and not possessors, without remembering that the context was the upending of empire and people seeking to pull themselves away from the monarchy and the church that represented that monarchy. And so it was a radical paradigm revision. It's also apostolic. It's neither Catholic. Quakerism is neither Catholic nor Protestant. And this comes from Rufus Jones, my New England compatriot. Quakerism, he says, at its birth was a fresh attempt to recover the way of life revealed in the New Testament, to reinterpret it, there's a nod to Wes's remix, and to relive it in this present world. Its founders intended to revive an apostolic Christianity. Theology. Theology literally means thinking about God, reflecting on the nature of God and God's self-disclosure in the universe and the life of humans. Harvey Gilman defines theology as reflection on experience that's undertaken in community. And I think that this is the essence of a kind of Quaker doing of theology. It's a theological reflection sometimes when you go to theology school, they talk about faith-seeking understanding from Anselm. And I think that Friends' practice of vocal ministry, of worship sharing, of sharing our stories, of testimony is the story of how God is at work in our lives and how our lives then change in response to God at work. Vocation. I'm going to share with you 3 definitions of vocation. The first, and I should credit Khaled Keefe-Perry, who is my partner in thinking and in life, for lifting these definitions up. Vocation is the long arc of a life spent searching for purpose and acting out call, and it applies to individuals as well as collectives. While vocation often appears more clearly as one looks back, discerning one's next steps towards a life of meaning and purpose is the ongoing work of vocation. And I'm going to skip the second definition and just go to the last one because it's longer and I want to have time for some examples. You are the only you that has ever lived, says Howard Thurman. Your idiom is the only idiom of its kind in all of its existence, and all of existence. And if you cannot hear the sound in the genuine in you, you will all your life spend your days on the ends of strings that someone else pulls. There is in you something that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine. And sometimes there's so much traffic going on in your minds, so many different kinds of signals, so many vast impulses floating through your organisms that you are buffeted by these. And in the midst of all this, you have got to find out what your name is. Who are you, and how does the sound of the genuine come through you? Vocational ministry usually refers to the work that is done by a person who makes their living through some sort of church-related work. And as Quakers are called to live the truth that is revealed to them as they listen collectively in waiting worship, they are called to the sound of the genuine, to the unique part of themselves. And I have competency up here, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. Ministry. Let me go. So I talked about how early Friends abolished the laity. And it's a great responsibility to take on the work of ministry. And in some traveling and work that Khaled and I did at Intermountain Yearly Meeting, and then again here in New England Yearly Meeting, we've sort of worked out this little, this easy framework for what ministry is. Ministry is sustained intention, that's the SI, prayerful attention, and guided action. Sustained intention, prayerful attention, and guided action. And the action part of it then leads to back to intention. It's a praxis. And ministry among friends emerges in community. It is shaped by our community. The gifts we're given grow out of community. And I think this is where the apprenticeship that Wes Daniels talks about is so key, not only in the way he talks about a pastoral theology, but for a theology of vocational ministry. Because community, says Patricia Loring, is the gestalt of the religious society. Community is the fertile ground that gives rise to gifts of the Spirit and gifts that can be employed in ministry. And community is brought together by God, not by us. Parker Palmer says that in true community, we don't choose our companions. In fact, it may be the place where the person you least want to live with lives, but it is the community that is given to us by God. And it's this kind of tug between individual and community where vocation and ministry emerge. And what I wanted to do was to give some examples. We talk about how is it embodied and enfleshed, a Quaker theology of vocational ministry. And so I wanted to lift up some experiences that I have been lucky enough to have of apprenticeship. When I first came to Friends as a 20-something, I wandered into Berkeley Friends meeting on Vine Street. I wasn't there but for 3 meetings. Oh, there's Ben Lomond Quaker Center again. I wasn't there but for 3 meetings for worship when Miriam Berg marched up to me and thrust a copy of No Cross, No Crown into my hand and told me that I must come to the reading and discussion group that met on Wednesday nights. She came with such authority to me and was so clear that that was what I was to do. I didn't even question it, and I showed up. I, at that point in my life, wasn't a Christian. I had grown up in a secular humanist home. I wasn't any issue against Christianity. I just hadn't really been exposed to it. But that act and immersing myself in that book with that small group of people opened the power of early Friends to me. And it was the beginning of a kind of apprenticeship. Apprenticeship requires not just the apprentice, but also some master builders, some masters to whom you are apprenticed. I then became a member of Strawberry Creek Meeting, and I became a member because at my very first experience of yearly meeting, I think there was some back room wheeling and dealing at work, but I ended up in the worship sharing group with Mary Schutz, another woman of great weight and authority, who at the conclusion of the yearly meeting worship sharing sessions, called me up and said, "You will return to your meeting and apply for membership." And it's like she used the force. And I just sort of said, "I will return to yearly meeting and apply for membership." And it was that applying for membership before I even really knew I was ready or considered myself good enough to be a Quaker. I just knew that I had yoked myself to these people and I was to become part of this group. And what Strawberry Creek ended up doing for me was that during a time of great sort of psychological and spiritual breaking in my life, I came to them and I asked if I could facilitate a group on addiction and the 12 steps, because I was wrestling with that in my own family and my own life. And ministry and council said no. But you will meet with these 2 friends every Friday, and you will wrestle with the spiritual questions that are troubling you. You can go find 12-step groups elsewhere, but you can't wrestle with these spiritual questions in a Quaker context in those 12-step groups. And these women met with me for a year on Friday mornings in their home. That was a kind of apprenticeship and teaching that I can't imagine, I couldn't have imagined ever having before it happened to me. And then the last story of it being enfleshed that I want to share is from Ben Lomond Quaker Center, where I was invited by itinerant traveling minister Bob Schmidt from Northern Yearly Meeting and Elaine Emily from the Southern California quarter of Pacific Yearly Meeting to serve as an elder at a closing retreat. And I had no idea that I had these gifts. They named these gifts and they lifted them up in me and another person. And during that retreat, a group of us had a small meeting for worship much like the traditional Quaker opportunity that was so covered and gathered. I have had no experience like it since. But we were yoked to each other, to those traveling ministers, and then through them to our friend Lloyd Lee Wilson, who is here, who helped to shape and apprentice all of us. And the fruits of that gathering and of that group who stayed together for years with each other have just blossomed all throughout the religious society and beyond. It all rests, I think, on authority and discipline. The authority that comes through God and the discipline in the monthly meeting. Apprenticeship requires discipline. It requires coming back again and again, and it requires a leap of faith into trusting those who are guiding us, and also a willingness to learn the tradition. It also requires a clarity of invitation and sometimes generous exclusion. This book, The Art of Gathering, has been very important to me, both in as I'm creating a new semi-programmed meeting space, which is new in New England Yearly Meeting, but practices a very clear invitation of who we are. We are Christian Quakers. And if that's not where you want to be, it's okay. There are lots of other meetings to go to. This is what we're doing here. And then sort of lastly, Khaled came up with this piece of Quaker math. 1 hour a week does not equal the 168 hours available in the week. We have to be with each other. If we're going to lift up the vocations and the ministry in our midst, we have to be together in community and to know each other. And then this is a stock slide that comes with the presentation, but I think that to close, my main point is that a theology of Quaker vocational ministry is also a practical theology of Quaker ministry. It's grounded in the lives and practices of us as a religious society. As we deepen more and more into our calling, into the sound of the genuine, and conforming our lives as individuals and meetings to continuing revelation, it requires that we see ourselves, as Wes said, as part of the present and historical community of friends, accept its authority, and proceed accordingly. And that's my part of that dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristina, for such wisdom. Without further ado, we're going to move on to our next presentation. And before we get there, just remember, we will have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Just go ahead and drop your question in the chat box, and we will do those after we have our next two presentations. So Emily Provance, take it away.
Thanks, Christy. So friends, for the last couple of months, I have been living alone with a cat, which is a new experience with me, the cat part. And so I've been spending a lot of time observing and thinking about cats, and it's not a surprise that that was what came to the forefront for me as I sat with what to speak to you about today. I have this experience that happens multiple times a day when I enter the living room and the cat, whose name is Juniper, is posed right on the edge of the couch, on the arm of the couch, and she is preparing to leap to the countertop, which is in the kitchen. This being a very small apartment, the couch is quite close to the kitchen. And no matter how many times Juniper does this, every time it is a process. She's there, she's on the edge of the couch, she sees the countertop, she knows this is where she's being pulled to, she knows this is where she's going. She sits carefully, she watches, she does the mental calculations, tenses up her haunches, and then she jumps. And most of the time she makes it. Occasionally she doesn't, and actually that can be kind of funny, but most of the time she makes it. And friends, this to me is so much like the experience of ministry. It is that being posed on the edge of something and knowing there is another place to which we are called, and that moment of finding clarity to go ahead and make the leap. And when we talk about a Quaker theology of ministry, a part of that is that any one of us at any moment might be called into that kind of a jump. But the Quaker theology of ministry, I believe, also includes the role of the community. And so if I take the covenant community and I put this into our cat story, I imagine all the other cats coming around Juniper and sit. First, they have to notice that she's on the edge of the couch and she's preparing to jump. And then they sit with her and they say things like, okay, are we sure this is the right counter? Are we sure the call is not to jump to a different counter? Are we sure that this is the right time to make this? This is the cat clearness committee. But then there's also an additional role that the community plays, which is that sometimes the community can see, you know what, it's too far from the couch to the counter. We're gonna put a little stool in the middle so she can jump from the couch to the stool to the counter so that it is more likely that she will safely reach the other side. I want to talk about what that stool might actually represent. What does that look like in real life? And the example that I would put in there, let's take a simple example of one individual called to rise and give vocal ministry one time. This individual standing and giving vocal ministry is not an island, is not alone. There is a community around her. And some of the things that that covenant community does to make this giving of ministry possible. One is that they are very deeply in worship. The whole community is centered. That plays a role. Another is that hopefully the community has at some point taught this person, what does it mean to give vocal ministry? How do I know if this is an actual call or it isn't? The community has established an environment where the individual knows that if she screws it up, no one is going to shame her. And hopefully the community has also taught her that if she does make a mistake, they will come alongside her and help her know how to do it better the next time. The community has established an environment where the individual knows when I rise and give ministry, if it is challenging ministry, the community is going to try really hard to listen anyway. And the individual has been given the physical, practical tools that she needs. Maybe there's a microphone in the room. Maybe people are holding her in prayer, and hopefully the community as a whole is preparing its hearts to receive the ministry as it comes. These are all essential functions of the covenant community around the minister. When we're talking about vocational ministry, though, I'm assuming when we say that we're talking about a larger kind of a thing, that it's a ministry that's either ongoing or repeated over a long period of time, and that this ministry is consuming a significant portion of the minister's life. And then we get to the point where the stool that's needed in the middle is suddenly both more important and more complicated. Now there's a matter of ongoing spiritual support. There's constant help with discernment. There are emotional needs to be met. There are still physical, practical needs to be met. Sometimes there's help with logistics. Often there's a need for financial support. Often there's a need for help in establishing credibility, which can be done in multiple ways among friends. There's a need for elders. There's a need for accountability. when I first had the experience of feeling called into vocational ministry and of standing on the edge of that couch and knowing that there was this place where I was feeling called to leap, friends came around me and they told me the support of the ministry, making the ministry possible, is the responsibility of the covenant community. I love this theology. I love it because it makes sense to me, and I love it because it resonates in me like God. It feels like God because, of course, ultimately, the responsibility for making ministry possible belongs, in fact, to God. But God very rarely makes things possible by way of like magic wand. It happens, but it's rare. And what happens a lot more often is that God makes things possible through the support of a covenant community into which a person has been placed. I love this theology, this concept that I was told that the covenant community is responsible for making sure that ministry can happen. I love this theology, and friends, it's really dangerous. And the reason it is dangerous is because when we say this to ministers, it can cause the minister to jump. And sometimes the community isn't there. It is very easy to see how this hurts the minister, but I want to testify also that it hurts the community. And many times it hurts the community partly because the community never knew that this was an expectation, and they have never made the explicit commitment to do it. I have a very real question about whether we can say in the year 2020, now today, that our Quaker theology is that the covenant community bears the responsibility for making sure that ministry is possible. This is what I was told, and it resonates with me still, but I have a wondering about it. Because my question is, friends, is our theology not determined as friends by corporate discernment? And in my experience among Quakers in the 21st century, the majority of Quakers that I meet have never heard of this concept. And out of those who have heard of it, this idea that covenant community is responsible for empowering ministry, for making it possible, some friends who have heard of this outright reject it. I have still for a long time held that it is our theology that covenant community is responsible for empowering ministry because I believe that our ancestors are part of our corporate discernment. Our tradition, as it has been handed down to us, is part of the discernment of the covenant community. And our ancestors have told us the community is responsible for empowering ministry. But I really wonder if we can still claim this as our theology. I wonder if the tradition carries that much power when most living friends today are not in that place. And again, is it not the case that our theology is determined by corporate discernment? I have to tell you, I also wonder just a little bit about whether this is even possible in a modern context. Because when we look at our ancestors, at the way in which they lived, they were very often living as persecuted by their neighbors, which caused them to be a pretty tight-knit group. They ate food from one another's farms. They patronized one another's businesses. They married each other. They were each other's social circles. Their children went to school together. And today, many of us only see one another for 90 minutes a week. And the rest of our lives doesn't not exist. We still have the same number of social ties and commitments and experiences. We still have coworkers. We still have marriage partners. We still have children. We still have parents. We still have friends and neighbors. But they may not, and probably are not, Quakers. And I don't think that that means we have no commitment to them. So with a question that I'm holding is whether it's the case that it is a reasonable expectation that we friends today would have enough time and treasure and talent, enough energy to be able to keep going this idea of the covenant community is responsible for empowering ministry. I don't know that we actually have a coherent theology of vocational ministry today, because I'm not sure we've spent the time as a full religious society of friends, or as many of our local communities, doing the work to determine, to discern what that theology would be. And although I don't actually have answers to the questions I've been asking, I do have a few words for ministers and a few words for communities. From time to time, people who are relatively new in the ministry will reach out to me and say, what advice do you have? What have you learned? What is it that you wish you had known when you were where I am now? And one of the things that often comes up in that conversation is the idea that it will take quite a lot to keep the ministry going. It will take spiritual discipline. It will take emotional support. It will take establishment of credibility. It will take money. It will take many other things. And I have learned, or begun to learn, that the obtaining of all of this is part of the ministry the minister does. It can't be thought of as something else we have to do in addition to the ministry, because frankly, friends, that makes it way too hard. It is part of the ministry, learning how to accept the glorious help that sometimes comes completely unsolicited. I've had amazing elders. I've had wonderful models in ministry. I've had so much kindness, so much hospitality, so much prayer. Learning to accept these things is part of the ministry. And learning to discern what else is needed is part of the ministry. And learning to ask for what we need is part of the ministry. And learning to accept the answer no when we ask for something is part of the ministry. In fact, that's probably the hardest part, because many times the community that we ask doesn't want to say no. And because they're so uncomfortable with the idea of saying no, they say maybe, or later, or yes, when the real answer is we can't. So sometimes the minister finds themselves in the position of asking for something and then having to articulate for the community the fact that the answer is no. That's really hard. For our communities, what I hope for in our covenant communities is different from what I want, if I'm honest. What I want is for us to be deeply engaged in the question of how do we support ministry. But the thing to which I think we may be actually called is more basic than that. Because as I have traveled among friends, I have only very rarely encountered friends' communities that are not entangled and chained by the dominant culture of the place where they live, by the things that we do just because that's what we do, by conflict avoidance, when what I would hope for our communities is that where we actually are is asking ourselves all the time, what does it mean to be faithful to God together? What does that call of us? I suspect that would be something quite extraordinary if we were able to collectively commit to that question in each of our communities. So I want to end it with a prayer, and I would pray for our communities and for each of us as friends that we all know that we are the cat on the edge of the couch, and that it might be the case at any moment that we are called into some great leap, that we would expect that from God within the context of our communities. And to friends who either are now or maybe soon actively engaged in vocational ministry, my prayer is that we will know that it is faithful to say no to a calling if following that calling right now will lead to our harm. Thank you, friends.
Thank you for those powerful prophetic words, Emily. We appreciate it. And one final presentation from Lloyd Lee Wilson. If you are ready, Lloyd Lee, take it away.
Unmute, please.
You ready, Lloyd Lee? It's all good.
It's all good. I'm not sure I'm ready. The verse that comes to mind is, at last, as to one untimely born to me. It has been a deeply humbling experience to be present through these past 2 days. I'm Lloyd Lee Wilson, an apprentice to the Quaker faith tradition for some 50 years now. I am a recorded minister. I'm here today under the authority of a travel minute issued by my monthly meeting and the specific release of my anchor committee in that meeting. I once heard Will Cooper say that we Quakers we tell so many stories about ourselves because without creeds or dogma, we have no other way of remembering who we are as a faith people. And I'm not able to articulate anything near an adequate theology of Quaker vocational ministry. I can tell you some stories from a lifetime of wrestling over an adequate response to God's call to holy surrender. And my sense is that there may be some themes in what I've lived through that are common to the other presentations we've heard. I've learned 3 lessons, or I want to share 3 lessons that I've learned in these stories. God's call to individuals is persistent and perceptible. The call is to a life of surrender, not to a particular mission. And one's vocation in ministry is meant to be lived out in the threefold relationship among individual, God, and the faith community, what Emily has called the covenant community. God's call is persistent and perceptible. Jacob wrestled with the angel for a night. I've wrestled with God over the call to ministry all my life. When I was 7 years old, my grandmother laid hands on me and prophesied that I would be a minister. Then she looked over at my younger brother and said, he'll be a doctor. At age 12, I stormed into the kitchen, slammed my hand down on the kitchen table as hard as I could, and declared fervently that I would never be a minister, and stormed out of the house. And 2 years later, I was named the youngest certified lay speaker in the Methodist Church in the entire Delaware, Maryland, Virginia Peninsula. I'd become a 14-year-old supply preacher. And yet in my late teens, I became completely estranged from Christianity and angry at the institutional church, wanted nothing to do with it. And then at 22, I stumbled into Quakers by accident and stayed because I was told to by a voice I did not recognize. And at 32, while wrestling over whether or not to accept a job offer that would involve a major relocation, I heard a voice tell me, if you can't do this job, how can you be prepared for the next one I have in mind for you? Recognizing a divine voice, even when I didn't believe in divine voices, I took the job. And not long later, I came home to Christianity and knew the place for the first time. Public ministry started to flow through me in unexpected ways, and it has not stopped in various forms and forums for about 4 decades now. God's gospel order means the right relationship of every part of creation with every other part. God yearns for each one of us to find our place in that greater relationship, in that gestalt, and to fill it. God calls each of us in that direction toward our place persistently and perceptibly. I've found over the years that sometimes that call is more perceptible to others than it is to me. I know at times I've resisted it openly. I also know that acknowledging and surrendering to God's persistent call has been life-giving to me. Holy surrender. I have not been called to a specific ministry or equipped with a specific set of gifts. The call I have heard is a call to a relationship, to a total surrender to the will of God, a complete reorientation of my life to do God's will. He must increase, and I must decrease. My desire has become to do everything God asks of me and nothing else. Surrender to that call has meant 3 things: arranging my life so that I'm able to hear God's direction, making sure that I am available to obey, and that I'm a prepared tool for God's work, a sharpened saw, not a dull one. In order to be able to hear the divine voice, I have become dedicated to the spirituality of subtraction. Everything in my life is subject to one question: does this help or hinder my ability to hear God's voice? Everything that hinders that ability must be pruned away. 2 examples. One is social media. I have no personal web page, no Facebook account, no Twitter or Instagram, whatever. I don't feel any of these things are wrong. They're obviously quite good and useful and advance the gospel for some people, but whenever I ask the question myself, and I do that frequently, the answer I get for me is that they would hinder my ability to hear God's voice, so I don't do them. On the other hand, sometimes what looks like the spirituality of subtraction isn't. I've come to a reasonably distinctive pattern of dress, not plain dress, but dressing simply in a peculiar facial hair that is a believer's beard, and I've stopped getting my hair cut. But I've come to this one step at a time over 50 years, struggling against it most of those 50 years. And I believe I've been led this way, not because it's a better or worse way of dressing or that it makes a religious witness statement, but simply as a personal ongoing exercise in listening and obeying, not questioning, not saying, why, God? You have to justify yourself to me. But yes, God, I will do that. The availability to obey. Over my lifetime, I've learned the importance of making a clear distinction between my competency, what I do to put food on the table, and my vocation, my calling to God's service. I chose very early, while I was still an undergraduate, not to work in the for-profit sector. And I've at times traded a reduction in pay for an extra 2 weeks to travel in the ministry each year. I've relocated to a different town 6 times in response to a divine instruction to be available for whatever work it was that God had me to do. Ministerial work, not competency work. And each of those involved a change of occupation. In a spiritual, emotional sense, I aspire to have no possessions, to view everything, including each breath of life, as the new gift of God. If I can keep that mind, then there is nothing of mine to give up in order to do what God asks. It all belongs to God already. My experience has made me leery of money's distorting or suppressing effect on prophetic ministry. There are certainly places where we need people who are able to devote their full-time attention to ministerial service. Certainly spiritual formation, adult religious education are just 2 of these. The work of administration, as Robin lifted up to us, is ministry. But since 1985, when I left the employ of Friends General Conference, I've paid my own way in ministry, arranging for time off from my competency, paying my travel expenses and the like. I've accepted financial support for room and board and travel expenses when offered, but no honoraria. Our yearly meeting has a trust fund for travel in the gospel ministry. Since I began soliciting donations to that fund, I've declined to accept any money from it. I understand my situation of privilege or luck or opportunity or fortune in order to be in that position. But I've talked to too many pastors, Baptists as well as Quakers, who will get to a certain point in the conversation and say, that won't preach in my church. I can't preach that or I'll be fired. And I understand what Friend Baisley said about having our suitcases close at hand. But we're all human. to be prepared to serve. Each day I am at rest is a day of preparation for the next call. Again, God gives guidance about how to prepare if I am listening. And I find there are recurrent themes. One of them, of course, is spiritual preparation. And I find that the longer I'm in this relationship with God and my faith community, the more spiritual nurture I need for daily sustenance. My disciplines range from daily private retirement and prayer, family devotions, regular scripture study, and beyond. For the past several years, Susan and I have observed an annual month-long Sabbath in first month on retreat in our home in the country, minimizing all outside contact, secular and religious, undertaking an extended examine of the past year and extended discernment on what God is calling us to in the next 12 months. It's been very important to me to be historically rooted. My first worship inside a meeting house did not feel like coming home. I did not discover that I'd been a Quaker all my life. It felt weird, and I felt like a stranger. But a voice told me that this was now my spiritual home, full stop, period. And it has never released me. I felt obligated to learn as much as I can about this peculiar faith where God has planted me, to understand its strengths and its weaknesses as a living faith with deep historic roots that nurture and shape it as that faith nurtures and shapes me. I see my experience described and explained in the writings of early friends, as early friends saw their experiences described and explained in Scripture. A brief word about formal training. I was recognized in the public ministry without having any formal religious education. But in 2009, some 20 years after I was recorded, I did get a master's degree from Earlham School of Religion and Quaker Studies. I needed to learn what I didn't know, but I also needed to unlearn what I knew that wasn't true. And both those actions are important. I studied formally not to qualify as a minister, but as a minister, I studied formally to hone and improve those gifts already entrusted to me from God in order to be a more faithful and more useful minister. Personally, I find the not doing is the hardest part. Part of me still wants to accomplish, to achieve, to write more books, to do a dozen more Quaker Speak videos, to leave a legacy. And what God calls me to do is to be still until I'm given a specific task, to do that task and return to stillness. My one continuing job is to be ready. It's been impossible for me to be a faithful public friend without the participation, guidance, and support of my local faith community. In the 1980s, a recognized minister at my monthly meeting asked if I would be willing to be recorded in the ministry. And I replied that was a matter of corporate discernment and call by the monthly meeting, and that my only response was to accept the discernment of the faith community either way. I should note that at this time, there are already 5 recorded ministers in that meeting of about 90 persons, 3 women and 2 men. Since that time of recording, I've moved from one town to another 4 times. Each time in obedience to divine instruction. My intent has been each time to leave my previous recording behind when I transferred, to see how I might be called to serve this new community without presumptions. In each case, after a shorter or longer period, I've been recorded in the gospel ministry again. But the possibility was real each time that I would be needed and used in a different way in this new community that did not involve recording or public ministry. But the community needed to discern that. A couple of years ago, at Friendship Meeting, where my membership is now, I felt my public ministry was over. And I felt I could take off the yoke and the plow. And my anchor committee held my feet to the fire and saying, God's not done with me yet, and that I should continue to serve our society as a public friend. I surrendered to their discernment, which I believe has proven correct. I want to point out that being recorded is only the first step, one that clarifies the need for enabling and equipping the individual to serve as called. In each of the monthly meetings I've been recorded in for, a different structure was used to accomplish the discernment and development of gifts and proper exercise necessary to meet the needs and the tasks of the community. And the important thing is that the structures are there, not the nomenclature or what they look like in detail. The relationships that have been important to me have been personal relationships with other ministers, and especially with named elders, support or anchor committees, regular reporting to my monthly meeting, travel outside the meeting only with the approval of a travel minute, and being accompanied by a companion, often a named elder, whenever I'm physically traveling in the ministry. Sharing our stories with other ministers have taught me a lot as a model of what to do and as a toolbox for how to deal with unusual, disruptive, or unsettling situations, what to expect and some of the ways to react to it. Elders have been precious to me. Their encouragement can be terse. When I faltered in vocal ministry one first day, the elder sitting next to me leaned over after I sat down and whispered in my ear, "Don't do that. It only encourages them." Wonderful encouragement, direction, specific guidance on how to correct what I was doing wrong. Shorter than the Jesus prayer in English. Their admonishments have often been equally terse and equally valuable. And having a companion on travel has been precious also. And I'm particularly thankful for Charles Ansell, Mike Arnold, Mark Woodka, Susan Wilson, who have accompanied me on multiple and on extended journeys and gained a deep perspective, both on what I should be doing in order to do ministry well, and where my weaknesses are and where I'll always need help at accomplishing. Conclusion. In my lifetime, North American Christianity has largely embraced individual piety as the goal of religious life. But my own experience, illuminated by the combined witness of 3 centuries, persuades me that Quakerism's different vision is closer to the mark. Our goal is to establish the kingdom of God throughout the creation, a gospel order in which harmonious relationship is sustained under divine guidance and assistance. If we do that, individual piety will take care of itself. Our goal is right relationship, not piety. And this changed understanding means that a solitary Quaker is not possible. The local faith community is the basic unit, like a hive of honeybees. Yeah, that models the kingdom as lived reality. That basic unit, the monthly meeting, gets the spiritual gifts it needs to accomplish their task, to be a colony of the kingdom and to plant new colonies elsewhere. So meetings have a responsibility to name these gifts as they emerge and as they manifest, to help individuals claim them and develop them and exercise them faithfully, and to agree to receive the fruits of faithfulness as they're exercised, as Emily has pointed out to us. Gifts become more clearly manifest as the individual and meeting jointly acknowledge them, and they get suppressed if we won't name them. The call to individuals is a call to become a servant, not a call to exercise with specific gifts or a specific mission objective. One can see in hindsight that one has been used in specific ways, but we shouldn't use the hindsight of the past to put limitations on the present or future divine possibilities. And as Emily said so eloquently, the specifics of how one serves once it's surrendered. Once one's become a servant are the task of the corporate discernment of the entire faith community. And we need to work at that. Thank you.
Thank you for such powerful wisdom, Lloyd Lee. We are at about 22 or 3 minutes left for our stated time of about 2.5 hours. I, as the moderator, have decided that each of the presentations, they had a little bit extra over their time, but it was so rich I didn't want to cut it off. So that means is that I want to jump straight into our question time. We've already gotten a few questions throughout the presentations, and we're going to work through those. And then if you have other questions that have popped up and that you wanted to ask as a result of one of response from one of the panelists, please do so. Again, we're going to strive to respect people's time and be done sometime around 1:30. But if it feels as if you know, the spirit's moving and we want to go 5 or so minutes over, we can do that as well. Now, first, we just had a request for Emily specifically. This is from Kevin Mortimer. If you could put the query that you included in your presentation in the chat, and then share that with the rest of us. You just copy and paste it, drop it in there. That would be really appreciated. Again, remember, we're going to have the chat and the video available. Sorry, Emily, were you going to say something? I talked over you.
I was giggling when you said copy and paste because it is not written down, but I think that I can make it happen again.
Okay, fantastic. I'm certain that the problem sometimes is when you say something, you know, it sounds magical when you speak it, and then if it's not written down, it's gone. So I'm praying the magic returns. So this is a question which carries some seriousness. Is from Wendy Cooler. Earlham School of Religion is currently facing a significant threat to its existence. And this is Wendy's words. We have had a substantial portion of our endowment taken from us. We have lost staff, and the dean has lost many of their administrative powers. Staff no longer directly reporting to them. This is despite the fact that ESR is thriving as a seminary. I believe in what Robin was saying about how we have a tension about how to support our leaders, many of whom have come through ESR. Now, how will Friends create leaders in the first place if ESR in particular is forced into non-existence by Earlham College? I wonder how we can discern quickly how to respond to what is happening with ESR, even as we are stressed already by the question of what to do to support the young Quaker leaders that it has educated. Now, not everyone on the panel may be an ESR alum, but I think we can all speak to the question of formation. This question is for everyone in the panel. If anyone wants to speak specifically to that from their experience, jump straight in.
I mean, I feel like I'm the obvious person to say something since I work there.
Didn't want to point you out, Ben.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I'm also should say that I'm reluctant to to make what feels like my personal work trauma the subject of this group, which I thought had some really extraordinary presentations on it. So let me try to think about this in terms that I think have been evoked on this panel. And I think the way I cut my disclaimer that I have the privilege of working among friends, but am not myself a Quaker, but have really learned from the Quaker process of collective discernment that is, with certainly some slip-ups, pretty effectively practiced by our faculty. And hearing all the talk about what it means to do things differently and at risk and in community, I think all of those ideas about how Quakers govern themselves and discern together are at issue, not just at ESR Earlham, but at places like, that are in crisis like Guilford and other organizations, because they're typically not fast. They don't look efficient from the outside, but to lose them and to lose that collective discernment is not just to lose a governance methodology, it's to lose something that's essential to the ongoing formation of what the group is. And that's one of the things that, I can talk more about the various frustrations that are really specific to how the situation has gone down. But the sense of shared mission around shared values is what I'm struggling with. I'm fortunate to have dedicated a job that involves ministry, but I think most of us take part of our payment in shared mission and ownership of that shared mission. And and I can't speak to how that echoes in the broader world of friends, but I can say that the morale has been a struggle at my place of employment.
So I'd like to say that I'm not sure that this panel is going to have answers to what to do about the situation at ESR specifically. But I think the question of how do Quakers continue to engage in the formation of leaders is a relevant question to this weekend's panels. And I think we heard about a model of apprenticeship and the ways that that has worked in times long past, in our lifetimes. And I think there will continue to be multiple ways of doing that work, of living into that leadership, and to be, I think one of the places that our leadership is formed is in our ordinary lives, our secular lives, in the organizations we work in the families that we live in, and that will continue to be an important source of formation, whether that is in our paid employment or outside of it. But I think this question of what do we expect from institutions that have been established, and will they continue to exist past this generation? I think it's also true that the 20th century was the golden age of Quaker organization founding, and they are not all going to survive the 21st century. And I don't want that to be like, that is not a specific commentary on ESR, but in general, they're not all going to survive. And how we pay attention to the good endings, healthy endings of one form of institution, how resources are transferred, where life is and vitality is cared for, is going to be a huge piece of work of the Friends in Leadership, and in our monthly meetings, in our yearly meetings, in our colleges. That is I've wrote an article for Friends Journal earlier this year about a hospice movement for Quaker meetings, that we need to think about what is healthy and spiritually healthy endings, and the care for the caregivers who are going to have to do that hard work. The boards of Quaker colleges, the boards of Quaker institutions, the members of the quarterly meeting, ministry and council committees. That is the work that we actually have to do better, so that it doesn't all end up in lawyers.
We have in the Quaker tradition several models for formation, formal and informal. And just looking at what's going on in the present day, Brian Drayton in New England has spent decades encouraging young leaders in an informal mentoring way, until interrupted by the pandemic. Deborah Fish of Iowa Yearly Meeting, Deborah Shaw, and I of North Carolina Conservative were running a Deeper Roots program, intentional spiritual formation. And there are other, Christine Hall's program on the West Coast comes to mind also. Secondly, the actual work of meetings of ministers and elders to draw people with emerging gifts into those associations of seasoned friends who can swap stories and give each other specific encouragement and guidance. I think that I gained a tremendous amount from the formal study at seminary, but I will repeat again that it was the second step, not the first step.
Something that it seems that we've been discussing the last 2 days, and this question really brings up, is connected to a question that Ashley Wilcox asks about the question of credibility, and how do we ascertain credibility, and at one level, just sort of taking off my moderator hat, I personally would view theology as, in some sense, it is my ministry, but how to do it and how to become a Quaker specific theologian, there isn't much communal formation that has ever occurred for me personally in this, and situations like this are sort of an element of that, but this is at some level it's a very informal organization. So what makes me a credible theologian, what makes somebody a credible minister? Ashley asks, could the panel address how age, gender, any other factors play into how we establish credibility for our ministries in the Quaker world?
Christy, I'll give this one a try. I'm going to talk a little bit about education first and then about credibility. And I'm just going to use my own story. I was pretty clear that for me, the calling was not to participate in a formal seminary or a formation program. I had some sense of what education I needed, and I wasn't finding that in a program that was set up, even though there were some friends that encouraged me in that direction. So when it came to learning what I needed to know, for me, it was a tremendous amount of reading. There was a period of time when I read a little bit more than 100 books in 3 months because I discovered the practical ministry section of the New York Public Library. I went back and read old minutes, every minute from New York Yearly Meeting from 1969 to the present. And I started visiting other yearly meetings and wider organizations. And I asked for a letter of introduction from my meeting so I could go to individual friends' homes, people that I just knew about and that I respected, and sit in their living rooms and ask them questions. So I'm still learning. I don't want to say that I'm not, but the period of really focused learning took a couple of years probably of really focusing on that. But establishing credibility turned out to be a different step. And it was one that I wasn't necessarily expecting to happen. Because of course, looking at someone, you cannot know what they know. And I had an awful lot of experiences for a number of years where I would sit down, for example, at a Quaker event in a cafeteria, and some very kind person would sit next to me and would say, "Do you know that the young adult friends are meeting over there in that other space?" This was never meant as unkind, but it was a signal to me of where I was expected to be and what space I should be occupying. That I did not have credibility as a full voice, as a full grown-up member of the Religious Society of Friends. And beyond that, there was the piece about getting sufficient reputation that I would be invited to ministry in places, which is how things kind of work for most of us now. There is still the following a call to go to a place. That still happens. It happens for me. But more often for me, it's about invitation to come and do a workshop or a speaking opportunity or something. And there was, like I said, a lot of building name recognition to get there, a lot of writing, a lot of talking to people, and it took a long time. And I want to name that it would have taken me longer if I had had other factors about my identity. One of the benefits I had was that I came from a racial and socioeconomic background that was similar to the people around me in the North American meetings where I was. And for that reason, I was fluent in the culture and I was able to figure things out that it would have been harder if I, for example, had been transported to Belize, which is an English-speaking country, but has an entirely different culture. And so to reverse that, someone who is not from the same socioeconomic background or the same culture as the majority does have a harder time figuring out, what do I need to say? Who do I need to talk to make things happen? The last thing I'll name really quickly is that in the beginning, friends used to ask me outright, "Are you a recorded minister?" And the answer is no. And people don't ask me that question anymore because now they've heard of me often before I get there and they don't feel the need to ask. I find that interesting.
The credibility we're looking for is that we are a faithful channel for the word. And that takes time. And it takes a lot of risky behavior, as Emily points out to us. But Bonus says, you start as an infant and you move up from there over time by experience. And when we make ourselves vulnerable to communities of friends by being active in the ministry, then they judge accordingly. As one friend once said to me, Lloyd Lee, when you first came to this meeting, I didn't like you very much, but every time you opened your mouth, you spoke to my condition. It takes time.
Something that I did want to sort of point out that we haven't really, that Emily kind of pointed to is this question of race, and the question of the role that the overwhelming whiteness of Quakerism and the fact that everyone on this panel is at some level, you know, we're white. What role do you think that plays, and what responsibility as sort of people in ministry and in ministry formation and our communities have to play in addressing that? Of course, answer that in the next 3 minutes because we're almost done.
I wanted to say something about that's actually related to one of the other questions about what have we stolen from our tradition and what should we give back, with the answer that we have inherited not just the great gifts, but also the failures of our ancestors. And we have to own up to them as well. I am an adopted daughter of the Quaker tradition, a convinced friend. It's not my ancestors buried in Quaker graveyards. But if I am going to claim the heritage and the gifts and the pride of what friends have done, I also have to wrestle with the failures of myself, the friends who came before me in all those generations. And thinking about what do we do that we enable ourselves to hear from friends in other parts of the world, because the Religious Society of Friends in 2021 is not a majority white. However, in the United States, we have one perspective, and what we value as theology, what we value as experience, and who can write in a paper of 2,500 words that could get published in an academic journal, even one edited by Quakers, is limiting by what we value and who we assign credibility.
I want to give folks a chance to jump in on that, but I also know that we are coming up on 1:30, and I want to know if we wanted to extend to about 1:35 and then wrap it up then. Are panelists up for another 5 minutes? Okay, great. One question that I think that we might want to come back to, and this might be one of our sort of last questions, is something that just came in that I thought was really interesting, brings it back to Ben's presentation earlier. This is from Kent Craig. The Warp and Woof project seems a great example of what narrative therapists would call an outsider witnessing practice, making preferred narratives more visible. Speaking about narratives and who gets to speak and credibility of narrative and all of that, and all of the inherent sort of racial questions of that as well. Could our meetings and communities experiment with new ways to recover our practices of acknowledging and witnessing the ministries in our midst? And this isn't specifically focused towards Ben, but this is a question of communities and narrative and formation, sort of what we've been talking about. So I will shut up now.
I want to offer a short answer to that and let other people speak, because I think what, to me, that sounds like is an invitation to testimony. And I don't mean like the spices. I mean like testimony to the work of God, of the living Christ in our lives. And I think that friends used to gather for longer periods of time than just an hour each week. And part of what they would do was to give that testimony. And, you know, that there were, we talk about how some northern dwelling indigenous folks have more words for snow. I think that there were more words for the kinds of vocal ministry that would be given at longer gatherings of friends. And one of these flavors of it was of testifying. And the other thing that did is done in community, it invites those with, and this word has fallen out of fashion, but I'm not going to think of another one in the short term, but those with oversight, gifts of oversight to help hold us to living into that transformation in our lives.
Anyone else want to tackle that in about a minute or so? Yeah, Emily, go ahead.
Yes, there are experiments we could do, beginning with those who are among us and often unseen. And one of those categories of people, I think, is our children.
That's an answer right there.
Yeah, I'll say something really quick. I have several things I want to say. One is that I think with this question, there's so many temptations on so many sides and so many ways to do things wrong. One of mine is to be primarily driven by how I look properly progressive and how I do things. But another one is to not to try at all to get people who are different from me on a stage, because you know, it doesn't happen if you don't try it. And I would say too that, like, interestingly for me in my context here in Richmond, Indiana, you know, we're Earlham community and sort of associated spheres are a little blue island in the big red sea. And I honestly think I fail if I don't represent any of the big red sea on the stage too. And I think I honestly miss the mission of the organization. It's much easier for me to recreate the Democratic coalition, as I kind of joke, on the stage than it is for me to represent what actually is the community. And I'm not talking about making people argue about hot button issues. I'm talking about telling stories, and which leads to the other thing. I think part of the ministry of fun is not nothing. Like, sometimes people having fun together is an extraordinarily valuable ministry to bond groups and keep the kind of community that's resilient enough to do the kind of hard work of discernment that we're talking about. And that's been true. I do work with Amigos, our local Latinx organization, and we have basically collectively discerned on the board with the executive director that we are highly about the ministry of fun and throwing great parties and inviting people effectively. I don't know if that answers that, but like, and for me, it's always helpful as I remember the social issues and the systems to remember, oh, these are the people I love who I'm doing this, that I do this work for. So the world sucks less for them. So I think those are all perspectives I try to bring to it.
I think we maybe have 30 seconds if anyone wants to share that last voice, that last thought they might have. And it's something that I'm learning about as a theologian and writer is that sometimes one of our temptations is to fill space with noise, just because we have to fill space with noise because we have to say things. I think that we can stop at this point. We have so much more work to do. We have so many more things that need to be said, so many more ministries that need to be recognized and lifted up, the Spirit moving in so many new and exciting and troubling and revolutionary ways. And our part as the Quaker Theological Discussion Group is to try to think about this in all these different ways as Quakers, as the, engaged in theology by discussion and by being a community. I wanted to thank you, everyone, for the last 2 days, particularly our panel, Emily, Lloyd Lee, Robin, Ben, and Kristina. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you very much for coming today. You have all, but because you have given us our emails, you have all been, whether you knew it or not, you're going to be getting emails from us in the future about stuff that we're going to be doing. I think this is the last 2 days, the most that anyone has ever actually in any one time participated in the Quaker Theological Discussion Group. So that is awesome, y'all. Thank you so much. Technology has really expanded our opportunities. So at some level, COVID has given us an opportunity to really change or at least transform what we do. And just from a group that meets in the American Academy of Religion to be a much potentially, have more of these conversations. So look for them in the future. We are going to be moving into our business meeting time in the next few minutes. So if you want to stay and talk about our search for a new co-chair, want to recognize Carol Spencer for her numerous years of amazing work. If you want to take a second and unmute, go ahead and celebrate Carol. And she's going to hate me for this, I know, but
thanks, Carol.
Yes.
Thank you, Carol.
Yay, Carol.
Thanks, Carol.
Carol is the best partner that one could have in this endeavor. But I know that there's going to be others who are just as amazing in many different ways. So again, if you would like to remain for our business meeting, please do so. We'll take about a minute or so to situate. If not, then thank you so much. And have a lovely afternoon, morning,